Psychiatric drugs and shooters. During the debate over marijuana legislation, a dark side to the use of legal drugs was largely overlooked. Because of the overuse and mishandling of legal prescription drugs, America has experienced a terrifying rise in teen suicides, school shootings, and the deaths of many veterans. Then Secretary of Veteran Affairs Eric Shinseki reported in November 2009 that more veterans have committed suicide since 2001 than we have lost on the battlefields of Iraq and Afghanistan. In May 2014, another shooting by a seemingly average kid rocked the nation. 22-year-old Elliot Rodger killed 6 people and injured 13 others in a rampage in Isla Vista, California, that ended with his taking his own life. Immediately, his father and the corporate mass media began the drumbeat, blaming guns for the carnage despite the fact that Rodger's first 3 kills were with a knife. There were no calls for registering or outlawing bladed instruments. Although Rodger also rammed at least one victim with his car, no one called for outlawing automobiles. In a manifesto left behind, Rodger stated, "I was different because I am of mixed race. I am half white, half Asian, and this made me different from the normal, fully white kids that I was trying to fit in with. I envied the cool kids, and I wanted to be one of them." This prompted cries that racial hatred was to blame for Rodger's crime. One of Rodger's victims, 20-year-old Bianca DeCock, who survived 5 gunshots, told how he wore a smirky, grimacy smile as he gunned down her sorority sisters. He wanted to do this. He looked happy about it, she told the news media. Elliot Rodger was only the latest in a string of young men involved in shooting incidents. The corporate mass media always blames firearms for the shootings, but a look at history reveals that prior to the 1968 Gun Control Act, any person could legally own all sorts of weapons, including machine guns. Yet these guns prompted no school shootings. What the media fails to mention is the common denominator in so many of these shootings: psychiatric drugs. Of course, gun makers, unlike pharmaceutical companies, do not spend millions on advertising. Few in the media have detailed the fact that Rodger was being treated for psychological and psychiatric issues. In his own words, he said, "I will quickly swallow all of the Xanax and Vicodin pills I have left." Is it not possible that Rodger's mental illness and the psychiatric drugs with which he was being treated are at least partially responsible for his heinous deeds? As Rodger's story illustrates, drugs may play a significant role in the recent spate of senseless public shootings, though in this case the drugs are legal. And as we see from Rodger's case, these drugs are being prescribed to more and more young people, frequently under the age of 18. When dangerous psychiatric medications are mixed with the typical tensions of adolescent life, the results can be deadly. Rather than continually send heartfelt condolences to the families of the victims, it is time for lawmakers to investigate the connection between prescription psychiatric drugs and violence. In nearly every school shooting, including the 1999 tragedy at Columbine High School, the shooters were medicated. In July 2012, James Holmes walked into a midnight showing of a Batman movie in Aurora, Colorado, and killed 12 people, wounding 58 others. The Denver Post reported Holmes was taking a generic form of the drug Zoloft. The fact that Seung-Hui Cho, who killed 32 persons at Virginia Tech in April 2007, had been undergoing psychological counseling involving the use of prescription psychoactive drugs was rarely mentioned in the mass media. In fact, the prescription drug use of other mass murderers remains unclear because authorities have sealed their medical records from the public. It is known that Army Specialist Ivan Lopez, who killed 4 persons, including himself, in an April 2014 shooting spree at Fort Hood, Texas, was being treated with Ambien and other medication for anxiety and depression. Likewise, Aaron Alexis, who killed 12 persons at the Washington Navy Yard in 2013, was being treated with the antidepressant trazodone. Sometimes the psychiatric drugs themselves are a factor, as withdrawal from selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, can be particularly unpleasant. British psychiatrist Dr. David Healy notes that almost all the school shooters that we know of have either been on or using these drugs or in withdrawal from them, a condition called SSRI discontinuation syndrome. While certain states of depression undoubtedly can be soothed by such SSRIs as Paxil, Prozac, Zoloft, Effexor, and others, Dr. Healy warned, you can become emotionally numb when you go on these drugs. That means you can do things you wouldn't normally contemplate doing. The website, ssristories.org, has begun to explore the potentially deadly effects of these drugs. It offers a collection of more than 5,000 accounts from popular media and scientific journals in which prescription drugs were associated with a variety of deviant acts, many of them violent. Withdrawal, especially abrupt withdrawal from any of these medications, can cause severe neuropsychiatric and physical symptoms, warned a post on this site. Withdrawal is sometimes more severe than the original symptoms or problems. Several stories recounted on the site involved the violent behavior of patients who had gone off their medication. One example was the tragedy of 35-year-old Derek Ward, who in October 2014 decapitated his mother, Pat, who had scheduled an appointment with a psychiatrist in 2 days to replenish her son's SSRI medications. Ward, who according to his family had been off his medications only 4 days, later died when he threw himself in front of a train. Even the government has acknowledged the dangers of SSRI drugs. In 2004, the FDA ordered pharmacies to provide to all parents or guardians for youngsters 18 and under an antidepressant patient medication guide, which stated, in part, call healthcare provider right away if you or your family member has any of the following symptoms: acting aggressive, being angry or violent, and acting on dangerous impulses. Never stop an antidepressant medicine without first talking to a healthcare provider. Stopping an antidepressant medicine suddenly can cause other symptoms. There are about 25 million Americans on SSRI drugs. If only 0.1% react violently to the drugs, that's still 25,000 potential mass murderers. Of greatest concern is the frequency with which these drugs are being prescribed. Early on, only severe cases of depression or anxiety were thought to warrant psychiatric drugs. But today, virtually any school kid may be subject to drug treatment, sometimes even against their will or their parents' knowledge. One such example is Chelsea Rhodes, a 15-year-old sophomore at Penn High School in Mishawaka, Indiana, who was pulled out of her classroom and told to sign a form, then was administered a teen screen psychological assessment test. The test included such questions as, have you had trouble sleeping? That is, trouble falling asleep, staying asleep, or waking up too early? Have you had less energy than you usually do? Has doing even little things made you feel really tired? Has it often been hard for you to make up your mind or to make decisions? Have you often had trouble keeping your mind on your schoolwork/work or other things? Have you often felt grouchy or irritable, and often in a bad mood, when even little things would make you mad? Have you gained a lot of weight, more than just a few pounds? Have you lost weight, more than just a few pounds? Like many teen students, Chelsea did as she was told and never asked if the test was voluntary. After the test, she was told she suffered from obsessive-compulsive disorder for cleaning and social anxiety disorder. She was told to seek medical treatment. Dr. Julian Whitaker, author and founder of the Whitaker Wellness Institute in Newport Beach, California, asked, since when are issues with sleeping, energy, and feeling tired indicative of a mental illness? What kid, or adult for that matter, hasn't at one time or another in the last 4 weeks felt indecisive, unfocused, grouchy, or irritable? And the last questions about weight are just plain nuts. Adolescents are expected to have growth spurts. But other test questions were less anodyne. They included, have you thought seriously about killing yourself? Have you tried to kill yourself in the last 4 weeks? Have you ever in your whole life tried to kill yourself or made a suicide attempt? As Dr. Whitaker remarked, one thing is for certain: if they'd never given any thought to suicide, they will now. The girls' parents, Michael and Teresa Rhodes, filed suit against the school, claiming their parental rights were violated since the school administered the psychological test without their permission, did not clearly state the test was voluntary, and made a diagnosis based on Chelsea's test answers. Representatives of the school, arguing the teen screen test was optional and confidential, moved for a summary judgment from U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Indiana, expecting to win as they usually do. However, noting that the school had not made clear that the test was voluntary and had not even filled in the name of any person or persons to whom the questions were to be referred, the court ruled in the parents' favor. This particular case was a victory for parents, privacy, and common sense. But many other children in U.S. schools have not been so lucky. A 2014 study based on information from the CDC's National Center for Health Statistics indicated that almost 11% of school children ages 4 to 17 are now taking psychiatric drugs for emotional or behavioral problems. Many of these medications purport to treat attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, a condition in the past described simply as restlessness or acting out of boredom. Such medications disproportionately harm certain groups of children. The study found that children from poorer families were more likely to be medicated than their well-to-do peers, and that boys were more frequently prescribed psychiatric meds than girls. Yet the science behind the so-called ADHD epidemic is not well supported. Some researchers, such as behavioral neurologist Richard Saul, do not even believe that ADHD exists, noting that the number of adults taking a drug for ADHD has increased 53% between 2008 and 2012, and nearly doubled for young persons, Saul noted. Today, the 5th edition of the DSM only requires one to exhibit 5 of 18 possible symptoms to qualify for an ADHD diagnosis. If you haven't seen the list, look it up. It will probably bother you. How many of us can claim that we have difficulty with organization or a tendency to lose things, that we are frequently forgetful or distracted, or fail to pay close attention to details? Under these subjective criteria, the entire U.S. population could potentially qualify. We've all had these moments, and in moderate amounts, they're a normal part of the human condition. As more than 20 conditions can lead to symptoms similar to ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder has too often become a diagnosis of choice that saves time for doctors and generates huge profits for the drug corporations. Even more disturbing is the number of very young children who are being prescribed these medications. According to a report by the CDC, more than 10,000 American toddlers on Medicaid were being medicated for maladies outside established pediatric guidelines, and an additional 4,000 children covered under private insurance plans were being medicated. It's absolutely shocking, and it shouldn't be happening, said a children's mental health consultant to the Carter Center. People are just feeling around in the dark. We obviously don't have our act together for little children, commented Anita Zervigan-Hakes, a consultant to the Carter Center in Atlanta, where the report on children was presented in May 2014. Dr. Susanna N. Visser, who oversaw the CDC's ADHD research, agreed. Families of toddlers with behavioral problems are coming to the doctor's office for help, and the help they're getting, too often, is a prescription for a Class II controlled substance, which has not been established as safe for that young of a child. It puts these children and their developing minds at risk, and their health is at risk, warned Dr. Visser. Dr. Nancy Rappaport, a child psychiatrist and director of school-based programs at the Cambridge Health Alliance outside Boston, specializes in underprivileged youth, many coming from broken homes. In acting out and being hard to control, they're signaling the chaos in their environment, she remarked. Of course, only some homes are like this, but if you have a family with domestic violence, drug or alcohol abuse, or a parent neglecting a 2-year-old, the kid might look impulsive or aggressive, and the parent might just want a quick fix, and the easiest thing to do is medicate. It's a travesty. Where once a daydreaming child was simply chastised by a teacher who ordered them to stay with the rest of the class, today they are sent to the school nurse who, more often than not, refers them to a psychologist inclined to prescribe medications such as Ritalin and Adderall. These drugs can calm a child's hyperactivity, but also have their share of serious potential side effects, including growth suppression, insomnia, and hallucinations. It's easy to see why it might not be the best idea to cause young children to experience these effects. The American Academy of Pediatrics guidelines do not cover children below the age of 4 because the Academy considers hyperactivity developmentally appropriate for toddlers and understands that more time is needed to see if a disorder is truly present. Despite this policy, one of the worst offenders in this unprecedented drugging of youth is Medicaid. As reported by the Alliance of Natural Health, ANH, in 2013, the number of children, many of them under the age of 3, on Medicaid who are taking antipsychotic drugs has tripled in just 10 years. Between 1999 and 2008, the amount Medicaid spends on antipsychotic drugs more than doubled. The program currently spends $3.8 billion annually on antipsychotics, more than it spends on any other class of drugs. A spokesperson for the Texas Health and Human Services Commission defended such drugging by claiming the prescriptions were to help infants with discomfort. Many of the antipsychotics used today are second- and third-generation antipsychotics with bizarre names such as Abilify, the nation's top-selling prescription drug, Risperdal, Seroquel, and Zyprexa. These drugs have replaced first-generation antipsychotics such as Haldol and Thorazine, though the side effects remain. As the ANH notes, keep in mind that common side effects for one common psychiatric medication include a shuffling walk, drooling, rapid weight gain, and the inability to speak. This list would give any adult pause. The fact that these drugs are being prescribed to infants is unconscionable, and the financial repercussions are equally damning. Due to the large number of people receiving antipsychotics who are on Medicaid, a full 70% of the total spent on these drugs in the U.S. is footed by the taxpayers. This is nothing less than crony capitalism in action, noted the ANH. Pharmaceutical companies donate heavily to political campaigns, and legislators pass laws that compensate them in spades for the amount donated. Those who pay the real price are the poor and powerless. The organization added that there is no corporate incentive for such essentials as nutrition, exercise, and love, as these pursuits cannot be patented. In addition to the mind-warping aspects of psychiatric drugs, recent studies show that memories can now be both created and erased through the use of drugs and the use of light to stimulate certain sections of the brain. Neuroscientists at the University of California, San Diego, found that by using light to activate neurons in the brains of rats, they were able to activate certain proteins that induced false memories. Research team leader Roberto Malino reported, "We can make a memory of something that the animal never experienced before." He added, "We were playing with memory like a yo-yo. If this can be done in rats, it can be done in humans." Some researchers believe it is entirely possible that the globalists even now are attempting to manipulate the minds of American citizens by funding research such as that in San Diego, as well as supporting legislation for mass mental analysis. The U.S. Preventative Services Task Force has urged routine screening for all American teenagers for depression, and politicians were ready to step up to the plate. Congress has periodically introduced legislation proposing widespread mental health screening. In 2007, legislation was introduced entitled the Postpartum Mood Disorders Prevention Act, which called for the mental screening of mothers for signs of depression. Such mandatory screening for depression may soon become state law in Illinois, and similar legislation has already been adopted, or at least introduced in several other states. In 2009, this mass screening scheme was proposed again in the form of the Melanie Blocker Stokes Mom's Opportunity to Access Health, Education, Research, and Support for Postpartum Depression Act of 2009, otherwise known simply as the Mothers Act. This law was reintroduced into both bodies of the new Congress in January 2009 after the 2007 bill died in the Senate. Critics of the Mothers Act, fearful that the legislation would mandate even further drugging of both mothers and infants, were incensed to learn that the same provisions were contained within President Obama's 2010 Affordable Care Act. In an article entitled "Branding Pregnancy as a Mental Illness," Byron Richards noted, "The Mothers Act has the net effect of reclassifying the natural process of pregnancy and birth as a mental disorder that requires the use of unproven and extremely dangerous psychotropic medications, which can also easily harm the child." The bill was obviously written by the Big Pharma lobby, and its passage into law would be considered laughable, except that it is actually happening. Investigative journalist Evelyn Pringle, writing for the political newsletter Counterpunch, wrote, "The true goal of the promoters of this act is to transform women of childbearing age into lifelong consumers of psychiatric treatment by screening women for a whole list of mood and anxiety disorders, and not simply postpartum depression. Enough cannot be said about the ability of anyone with a white coat and a medical title to convince vulnerable pregnant women and new mothers that the thoughts and feelings they experience on any given day might be abnormal. One can clearly see the susceptibility to drug abuse by new mothers, whose mental equilibrium is already shaky because of the rigors of childbirth, and especially first-time mothers concerned over the health of both their child and themselves. Many people feel the drugs and vaccines being administered to children have not been fully tested or guaranteed safe. They feel children are being used as guinea pigs for Big Pharma, and that such indiscriminate drugging amounts to nothing less than chemical child abuse. Health Ranger Mike Adams pondered, "I often wonder when the rest of the country will wake up and take notice that the mass drugging of our nation's children has gone too far. Why isn't the mainstream media giving this front-page coverage? Why aren't lawmakers demanding an end to the chemical abuse of our children? Why isn't the FDA halting these trials on toddlers out of plain decency?" You already know the answer, because they're all making money from this chemical assault on our nation's children. The doctors, hospitals, drug companies, psychiatrists, and mainstream media all profit handsomely from the sales of mind-altering drugs to children. Ethics will never get in the way of old-fashioned greed. Such drugging of future generations also advances the globalists' goal of societal control. Adams and many other concerned parents say children should be given more sunshine, playtime, and access to nature, rather than drugs. They say this is the historically proven and common-sense approach to producing balanced, healthy children. But psychiatry has no common sense, argued Adams, and no one in the industry dares mention that most so-called mental disorders are really just caused by nutritional imbalances, because to admit to the truth about the mental health of children would be to render their careers irrelevant. The ultimate issue is deciding where to draw the line on which behaviors are normal and which require some sort of intervention. Bipolar disorder, a psychiatric diagnosis describing persons, usually children, who display a wide range of emotions from exuberant highs to depressing lows, is seen by some as merely the normal ups and downs of the growth process. Critics are quick to note that there is no scientific means to confirm a diagnosis of bipolar disorder. In a 2009 interview in Psychology Today, David Healy, former secretary of the British Association for Psychopharmacology and author of Mania, a book on bipolar disorder, acknowledged that this disorder is somewhat of a mythical entity. The problems that are currently grouped under the heading bipolar disorder are akin to problems that, in the 1960s and 1970s, would have been called anxiety and treated with tranquilizers, or, during the 1990s, would have been labeled depression and treated with antidepressants, he said. Healy described claims that imbalances of enzymes such as serotonin, a gastrointestinal neurotransmitter enzyme believed to promote feelings of well-being, to explain mood swings as unsubstantiated biobabble. What's astonishing is how quickly these terms were taken up by popular culture, and how widely, with so many people now routinely referring to their serotonin levels being out of whack when they are feeling wrong or unwell, he said. Some feel it is fortunate there were no synthetic psychiatric drugs available to dull the moods of the master artist, Vincent van Gogh, who some historians believe suffered from bipolar disorder. And even for those who lack Van Gogh's genius but exhibit some behavioral issues, the drugs they are being prescribed are leading to disastrous effects. A 2014 study by researchers from the Bloomberg School of Public Health found that prenatal exposure to selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors was associated with autism spectrum disorder, ASD, and developmental delays, DD, in boys. Nearly 1,000 mother-child pairs were included in the population-based case control study, which also found that young boys were more likely to be affected by the development problems than girls. We found prenatal SSRI exposure was nearly 3 times as likely in boys with ASD relative to typical development, with the greatest risk when exposure took place during the first trimester, reported Dr. Li-Ching Li, Ph.D., a psychiatric epidemiologist in Bloomberg's Department of Epidemiology. This research illustrates the challenge for women and their physicians to balance the risks versus the benefits of taking SSRI medications, with everyone from infants to senior citizens being drugged for both real and imagined mental disorders. It is troubling to note that one group in particular has been targeted for selective drugging: our military service personnel.